welcome everybody to this latest edition of Talking Naturally. I'm Annie Tindley, a trustee of the Natural History Society of Northumberland, and it's my great pleasure to be talking today to Keith. Keith, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yes, my name's Keith Buchanan, and I'm sat here in Hexham at the moment.
Excellent. And how is it in Hexham today? A bit wet, or?
Well, it's thinking about raining, but dry so far.
Excellent. And you're just back from northerly climes, you've been telling me, back from Svalbard. How was that?
Yes. Well, it's a very extraordinary place, Svalbard. It was never populated. It has no permanent population. It was just visited by whalers and sealers, fur trappers traditionally. So it's also complicated politically because of that. There's a Svalbard Treaty, which gives Norway management of it, essentially, but other nations have a right to be there. So it's a strange place, both politically and physically. It's very austere, no trees. It's a very Arctic landscape, of course.
Yeah.
And we're right up to the ice age, about 81 degrees north, which is very interesting.
So were you there for work or for pleasure?
Well, I was there for pleasure, actually, with a Nature Trek group, although I do lead also trips for Nature Trek, and I did help out a little bit on the trip, but essentially a pleasure trip. So you have to see Svalbard by ship, a small ship, preferably. So that's where we were, on a small ship.
Oh, wow.
And doing lots of landings by Zodiac.
Oh, right, okay.
And which is ribs, rigid inflatable boats, and wet landings, that they call them. So you have to be careful not to get your feet wet. And also, the strange thing about Svalbard, if you're on land at all, outside the settlements, you have to have an armed guard with you because of the risk of polar bears, of course, the apex predator there.
Yeah,
Just amazing animals too.
And you saw some when you were there as well.
We saw 3 females, all with cubs, which was very encouraging.
Yeah.
And we had some nice sightings watching a polar bear suckling its cub, actually. Wow. She made a kind of seat in the snow with her front paws, and then she turned around and she sat in it, like someone sitting in an armchair, and put the cub on her front, and she sat there looking all around as the cub suckled. It was rather human. Position that she got into, which was very interesting.
That's fascinating. I'm so jealous, and it's it's and it's, I suppose it's quite a distance, sort of maybe physically from where you grew up and maybe first started getting into natural history and observation. Is that right?
Yes. Well, I grew up in Northern Ireland in County Derry. And actually, some of my earliest memories were poking around in the garden. I used to drive my mother mad because she had a little path lined with bricks on both sides. They were just set on the ground. They weren't fixed in. I used to be always lifting them up to see what was underneath them and pulling out creepy crawlies of all descriptions and putting them in jam jars. So the house had always got jam jars with creepy crawlies in them. That was my earliest memories of just being fascinated by that. And then I moved on to fishing for sticklebacks in local ponds and ditches, which I loved doing. And I always had sticklebacks in some container or other. And I'm ashamed to say, looking back in those days, collecting eggs.
Oh, controversial.
Yes, but of course it wasn't illegal then. It wasn't illegal, I think, till 1974. And I mean, no one told me I shouldn't be doing it. So my friends and I would collect. We never had very many, but we did collect a few eggs.
Yeah.
And I think that's how many people actually got an initial interest.
And that's been my experience doing these conversations, actually, is people kind of take an interest in their gardens and local areas and sort of pick up on the collecting practices of the time, and and sort of learn about the environment there, that kind of immediate environment that way. I mean, was there anyone in your family or in your school who kind of helped kind of form that or help teach you that kind of stuff?
No, actually, that's something I do regret. I never had a mentor of any sort really locally. This was just an intrinsic interest I had. I mean, my father was not interested in that sort of thing. My mother did have an interest in wildflowers, to some degree, but yeah, there was no one really to inspire me, as it were. It was just an endogenous thing with me. I was just intrinsically interested in these things. So I mean, if there are young people embarking on this journey, one of the things I would say would be very nice for them to have is some sort of mentor, I guess we would call them these days, someone to take them out, start introducing them to, you know, all the amazing groups of things that we have living in our countryside.
Yeah. And were you finding when you were growing up there, I mean, it's been interesting to ask people as well what they feel the main difference is now to, say, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, in the sort of UK Irish environment, what the main differences are in terms of biodiversity or increases or decreases. And I mean, was there a lot for you to see when you were growing up, I suppose?
Well, actually, the thing that strikes me most, Annie, about that is when I go back to the area where I was brought up, it's the loss of what I call the little wild corners. I mean, there was an old quarry near where we used to live, and it had, you know, rows of San Martin nests and all sorts of things growing in it. And, you know, when I went back some years later, it had been flattened, converted into housing. And I think of other little wild corners that I used to explore as a boy. I go to them now, they've all gone. They've been improved or built on or developed. So it's the loss of these small, you know, in themselves not very significant, but cumulatively very significant wild areas that I most feel. Of course, they're the more classic things that people talk about, which I also agree with, the lack of insects on your car as you're driving around.
Yes.
And I remember actually visiting my uncle who lived by the banks of the River Bann in Northern Ireland. And in the evening, sitting in his sitting room, you couldn't actually see out the window because it was completely covered with flies that had hatched from the river.
Wow.
Completely covered. And that's changed as well. It's not like that anymore. So it's the abundance of many things. I mean, it's one of the hidden aspects of loss of biodiversity, I often feel. We all know about species becoming extinct, but we don't talk so much about the loss of abundance as well, which is equally sad, really.
Yeah, I know. And so when you were kind of growing up, what drew you to, I mean, what were your next steps at school and moving into work and the sort of work you do now?
Well, yeah. Well, because I was always interested in this, I was very keen. I couldn't wait to start, you know, biology when it came available in the school. So I went on to do that. And I did zoology at university then in Dublin. And then I went and I did the MSc in nature conservation at UCL.
In London?
Yeah, in London. And at that stage, this is an interesting point as well. At that stage, in the mid-70s, there were only 2 places that did a master's in nature conservation. One, strangely enough, was Salford. Okay. But the best known one was the UCL, which was set up originally by the Nature Conservancy. Right. So it was very interesting to do that. And at that point of time, it was led by a man called Brian O'Connor, who went on to become for a period, the chief executive of the Nature Conservancy. So that was a very interesting period, and we spent a long time driving around in Land Rovers all over the UK, visiting nature reserves and talking to staff who managed them. So that was because I decided earlier on I didn't want to be an academic. I wanted to work in practical conservation. Yeah. So my good friend at school, who's ended up as a professor of zoology, I didn't want to go down that route.
Yes.
I wanted to do practical
something useful.
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. I mean, it's a bit severe, but you know what I mean. I wanted to kind of get my hands dirty, really.
Yeah. And
Um,
when you were on that MSc, and there was obviously, as you say, only 2 programs at the time, did you feel that you were kind of part of quite a pioneering group in a sense? Or did you feel like you were
yeah.
joining a wider community of?
Well, this was a developing concept, really, that we needed to conserve things, I think, in a practical sort of way. And it was also a good time in the sense that local authorities were starting to employ ecologists and similar people. So there was sort of a growing engagement with this sort of work, because money was not so tight and local authorities could afford to employ people doing that sort of thing. So there was a sense of, but I mean, there wasn't a sense of urgency. We hadn't started thinking about climate change.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was developing, it was becoming more widespread, that sort of thinking. But if I could just expand, I did join for a period the Department of Agriculture in Northern Ireland to do different kind of work. And I remember having discussions back then, when would this be, in the late 70s, and finding that there was no concept whatsoever in the department at that time about the need to conserve anything on agricultural land. It was still very much the drive for intensification, for improvement, and why would you be worried about these things? Haven't we got nature reserves for them? So, you know, I've seen a huge change, obviously, in institutions like that. But I was rather taken aback by how little awareness there was, even in the late 70s, about the need, you know, to conserve what we've got.
And it's interesting that, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure it wasn't just a Northern Irish thing. Probably you might have found those attitudes elsewhere, potentially in England, Scotland, or Wales. But that, I wonder where that came from, whether it was that kind of post-war drive for food security and increasing kind of standards of living, and then, but it just took so long for the conservation view to come through. It's amazing.
It did take a long time. Yeah, I think it was that, just, you know, the need to produce our own food, be self-sufficient to a degree, was still driving everything then. But actually, I remember when I worked for the Countryside Commission, the chairman at the time was a man called Derek Barber, who was very well known in agriculture and conservation circles. He was chairman of the Countryside Commission, and he'd grown up, as it were, as an agriculturalist. But I remember him telling me he had a moment. He happened to be standing in a field somewhere, and he looked up and he saw someone chainsawing down the last tree in the horizon. And he said that was the moment that everything changed for him. I always remember that.
Wow.
And he became a strong advocate then for conservation. Of course, we've seen this with other people, haven't we? Like Peter Scott, he was started as a wildfowler.
Yes.
And people overseas like Jim Corbett with tigers. People have a moment when suddenly they see things differently and they can switch to become conserving. And in a sense, I guess that's what we've sort of done as a nation. We've
enough
very aware.
Kind of created a bit of momentum around it, potentially, to change a culture. Yeah,
but I'm again often struck, I'm jumping around a bit here, but you know, we have more and more wonderful film of wildlife, and as all that gets better, all of that is disappearing. You know, there's a terrible irony about that. There's a sort of huge interest in these programs, the wonderful programs that David Attenborough's been involved in. And as we watch them, these things are actually disappearing. We're not very good at putting the pieces together and actually stopping that happen.
Yeah. I mean, what was your experience with something like the Department of Agriculture, and you're coming in to basically almost no recognition that this is an issue, to trying to, I mean, how did you find that? trying to
Well, I
change.
find it really difficult. And I mean, I was working for a while on animal health issues, actually.
Oh, yes.
So, but there was no engagement to be had within that department. I then moved to MAF, actually, and worked in Whitehall for a while with MAF. So I was going off to Brussels quite a lot.
Okay.
But even then, I wasn't involved in anything remotely to do with conserving wildlife. So actually, I left those organizations and joined this little organization called the Countryside Commission, as it was then, up in the Northeast, where I've pretty much been ever since.
And so what was, tell us about that early work you did with the Countryside Commission. What were you tasked with there?
Well, that was, I mean, the organization of these issues in the UK is sort of quirky. At that time, as you know, I'm sure, there was a division. The Countryside Commission was involved with landscape issues in national parks and people's enjoyment of the countryside. And that was dealt with separately in the Countryside Commission from the Nature Conservancy Council, as it then was, which dealt with specifically with wildlife and habitats. Now, most countries don't separate those two, really. So the UK has always been rather strange in that sense. So actually bringing them together into Natural England was a logical process. But nevertheless, that was a very interesting time. That little organization, the Countryside Commission, was a very effective little organization. But that says something about the sizes of organizations, I think, because it was small. Yeah. It was very fleet of foot, if you like. It was very unbureaucratic. There's a lot of discretion given to local offices. I was the regional director in the Northeast, and then of the Countryside Agency, which came after it, and brought other issues in from the Rural Development Commission. So we've seen a sort of evolution of organizations dealing with these issues, for better or worse.
That's right. Yeah. And what did you make of the Northeast when you arrived? Were you familiar with it at all before you started?
Well, not really. No, I didn't really have any involvement with the Northeast before I arrived. We were living in London, you know, because I was working for MAF, and we just wanted to get out of London, really. And also, Rachel's parents were up in Cumbria, so it was a bit closer. And I arrived at a difficult time, really, you know, the miners' strike and all of that was going on. But, you know, we just loved it, basically. You know, it's relatively uncrowded, and, you know, we've raised all our children here, and yeah, I don't know what it was about it. Yeah, it's just a lack of crowding, those lovely landscapes up in the Pennines and along the coast. Of course, I had a lot of involvement in the North Pennines, being heavily involved in the public inquiry, which resulted in the designation of the North Pennines as an AONB. So I became very involved in all of that.
Was that kind of making a case for that designation that you were involved in pulling together? Yes.
And I was involved in all the preparation for involvement in the public inquiry, which was when we designated it. You know, it needs obviously ministerial approval, and there was opposition. So
where did that come from? The opposition, was it?
Well, there was opposition from some of the district councils and from the farming organizations who were wary of it. And actually that public inquiry was quite influential in that it sort of teased out a clearer definition of the importance of landscape, and how you evaluate it, because it's not easy to do that. It's a more subjective process than in nature conservation, strictly speaking. So it was quite an influential process. And of course, it did result in confirmation of the designation of the AONB.
So a successful outcome.
A successful outcome, and all the good work that it's done since. And I think, you know, farmers' fears were largely unfounded, I think, at that time. And I hope it has now been, you know, it's well established now, of course,
Yeah,
as a
yeah.
designation. But I mean, that was a very seminal process for me about learning about how public inquiries work, apart from anything else.
Oh, yeah, I know. How have you seen the, it's really interesting, isn't it? All the sort of changes in environmental regulation and governance that you must have seen across your working life and career, you know, sort of small agencies up to working with across different local authorities, which must have changed significantly over time as well, and trying to make that case when, you know, huge social and economic changes like the miners' strike and that kind of move into post-industrial society were taking place. It must have been, I mean, have you noticed, has there been a big shift, do you think, in the way in which government at different levels approaches environment, or do you think it's actually hasn't changed that much? Or
Well, it has changed, of course, a lot, but the fundamental assumptions underneath a lot of what government does and society does, I think, are still based on a concept of growth,
yeah,
of economic growth. And, you know, it's always been a nonsense to me that you can have infinite growth in a finite system. I mean, it is a nonsense.
yeah.
And everybody would concede it's a nonsense, but nobody behaves as if it's a nonsense.
Yeah.
That's the problem. So that, I mean, joining the EU actually was a positive force for environment. There's no question.
Mm.
And the protections that it brought were less easy to dismantle, if you like.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're in a different world now, of course. So we'll have
Mm-hmm.
to see how that all pans out. And the advent of climate change as an issue, you know, came along. But, you know, I often think that we're very good at solving certain sorts of problems, you know, technical problems, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
We're very bad at solving these long-term problems that, you know, everyone must cooperate
Mm-hmm.
in doing. You know, it's the tragedy of the commons, perhaps. You know, what belongs to everyone belongs to nothing. So
Mm-hmm.
it belongs to no one. So, you know, conserving our climate and taking steps to fix that has been, you know, the hugest issue that's come along really in my working life, and we're still wrestling with that, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was in Natural England, I was leading the work to try and find practical ways that we could enable our wildlife to adapt to climate change. And this was largely about how we reconnected wild areas so that
Oh yes, yeah,
species were able to migrate through a landscape.
yeah,
Because, I mean, we know that species are moving north and east, all in all groups, it's well documented, but of course they have to have habitat to go to.
yeah,
So that's now conventional thinking, but, you know, I was involved in the earlier stages of trying to talk about that, have conversations about that in local areas, how we could join up areas of habitat or create new habitat patches that
yeah,
didn't exist. And I mean, I think we're still wrestling with that, you know, how you do that in a practical sense.
yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? There's almost like a pattern where you know, kind of not new issues, but issues kind of surface and become more important, and that you've almost been at the heart of those the early days of those conversations, whether that was climate change or wildlife corridors or whatever. And I mean, how important do you think it is or has been to influence policymakers and government in these issues? Or do you think it's
Well, yeah, it is hugely important. And I mean, it was interesting. I was around, you know, the whole advent of the agri-environment approach. I remember being out trying to identify the initial ESAs, as they were called, in the North Pennines. And when I was running the East Anglia part of the Countryside Commission, the region in East Anglia, we ran a little pilot scheme called Countryside Premium Scheme, which was giving farmers who had set aside land some additional money to do something positive in an environmental sense.
Mm.
And that was deemed to be a success, and that led to the countryside stewardship scheme, which is of course rolled out nationally and is now evolving post EU. So it's been very interesting to have been involved right at the beginning of that development of the agri-environment approach, which has been successful in the sense that, you know, we have national schemes, but of course we've got such strong tensions, haven't we? Because of, you know, the Ukraine and all of that, there's another emphasis on self-sufficiency,
Yes,
which might imply, you know, extracting as much food as we can, which might put some areas in jeopardy. So, you know, the tensions come and go, don't they?
yeah. So
And,
has
sorry.
it, no, I mean, has it been sort of the art of compromise then?
Well, inevitably, I think it has, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And when I was involved in all that, I mean, it's quite a while ago now, it was very interesting trying to quantify success, actually.
Yeah.
That was one of the biggest issues.
Yes.
You know, if you support someone to create a hay meadow, you know, can you pay by results? But that's very difficult because it depends on the soil types and the seed that's available. So someone might work very hard but not be very successful. So, I mean, that is something that's dogged these schemes, I think, a little bit. It's quite difficult to define success.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of serendipity in it. And, you know.
And I guess going back to something you'd said earlier as well, the timescales involved are necessarily, well, quite often times so long. You know, like, I guess measuring success might come in 50 years or 100 years, or when we see kind of climate change, or I think about kind of the development of forestry and kind of native woodland planting, etc. You know, I guess the results wouldn't be seen for 80 years minimum or longer.
Yeah, but I mean, that's an interesting example that you mentioned, Annie, of real progress. I remember in the Countryside Commission, those early days, often having to oppose Forestry Commission planting schemes, for example, in the North Pennines, where the normal output was a kind of doormat of Sitka spruce.
Yeah.
But that has changed, of course, out of all recognition, and the Forestry Authority now, of course, has a completely different approach.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's been huge progress in some ways, haven't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, yeah, sorry, yeah, just a kind of mixed picture always. But, you know, and there are successes, and, you know, the advent of rewilding, as you know, the gradual acceptance of that as a concept has been very interesting. And places like the Knepp estate have been hugely influential. And you know, economics, of course, is always the main driver. And, you know, some of those estates have seen actually economically that they might do better pursuing a different path.
That's right.
So
I mean,
that's been hugely influential, I think, that particular example.
yes, and going back to what you said at the start about those wild corners disappearing, you know, but then maybe the rewilding agenda might maybe possibility of bringing some of those back, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. But the thing is, landowners are hugely influenced by other landowners, and that's why that particular example has been so influential and potentially enormously important. But it's interesting that, you know, reducing your costs, of course, one way to increase your profitability is to reduce your costs, and that's the approach that they've been taking.
Yes, yeah, instead of that kind of high input, high output model.
Yeah.
Just kind of bring it down.
Yes, just reduce your costs and your profitability could go up more, which I suspect, I mean, I haven't, obviously that's a private matter for the estate, but I suspect that's what's been going on. They felt, well, if you read her book, and you probably have, as I have, they're on a kind of treadmill That's what they felt. So I
Yes.
guess other estates, yeah, have been feeling that as well. How that then relates, how you reconcile that with maximizing our self-sufficiency in food production, is a huge challenge, isn't it? And
it is. I think it is. I mean, and it's interesting as well. I think thinking about that, the governance point again, is that I suppose one advantage private estates have is if they're in the hands of one individual or family, they can make decisions quickly. Whereas, you know, representative or democratic institutions like local authorities or charitable landowners or the kind of government landowners, it takes longer, you know, to kind of have a shift in thinking and implement some of those decisions. So I guess it's where I think that's one of the reasons why some of the rewilding agendas come back on estates rather than the Forestry Commission, for example, you know. They can act at smaller scale as well, isn't it?
yeah, but yeah, just thinking about the forestry thing again. The other aspects that are interesting there as well. You know, at Kielder, where they started increasing the proportion of Kielder at one time was regarded by all of us as just, you know, basically Sitka spruce of no wildlife interest. Yeah, you know, you get a few chaffinches, etc., gold crests and wood pigeons, you know. But of course, we've had to revise our view of all that as well. First of all, they have been increasing the number of broadleaves, but also it's become actually very important, you know, as a refuge for red squirrels. We have pine martens colonizing. There's quite a few pairs of goshawks. So we kind of did underestimate a little bit the potential importance of even those sorts of, that sort of woodland planting.
Yeah.
You know, so we all have, you know, it's a learning process for all of us, I guess.
Yeah, it's and it's kind of back to that, the chronological scale as well, isn't it? Where, you know, you have to sort of, it's almost like 30, 40 years have to pass before that becomes apparent. Same way as like some negative consequences of environmental policy takes longer to come through than human timescales, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a difficulty, isn't it? Because, you know, woodland, we can't replicate ancient woodland.
No.
You know, within a time scale that any of us would really recognize, which still brings it back to the importance of conserving what we've got, of course.
Yeah, of course.
You know, we can create new habitat, and some of it's quite quick. You know, wetlands, you can establish an interesting wetland quite quickly, but ancient woodland, you know, by definition, just takes time for all those species assemblages to kind of formulate themselves in the woodland. So, you know, the rewilding and everything is fantastic, but we've still got to try and conserve the ancient woodland that we've got.
That's it.
So, yeah, all of this still evolving.
Yeah.
And it always will, I guess.
Yes, that's true. And so what do you do for fun now, Keith? Go
for fun. When I'm not doing this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Well, I left Natural England, and yeah, that's been interesting. I did some environmental consultancy for a while, working with people in Eastern Europe, actually. Work with national park managers there on management planning, etc. But now I do quite a lot of what you might call ecotourism. I take people to see things. Now that's an interesting conflict because we fly, you know, for example, to Gambia. Oh yes. And that's bad, of course. That's a big carbon footprint. But I'm very conscious that in that example, just to take it as an example, groups like us coming to the forest that we visit, we're actually directly supporting 5 or 6 local men as guides who are feeding their families, of course, on that. And by our visit, we give that forest an economic value, which means it's more likely to be there. So that's an interesting conflict, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's a positive, but of course the carbon footprint in getting there is a negative. So
Yeah.
how we reconcile those, it's very hard, isn't it?
Yeah, but and that's sort of the reality of these questions, isn't it? I mean, if there's a simple solution, we'd all be doing it. I guess.
Well, indeed, yeah. Hopefully we would anyway.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe I'm being a bit too optimistic there, but but yeah, that's interesting though, isn't it? And I suppose it's about awareness and education of those environments as well, isn't it? That ecotourism promotes and spreads. You know, there's a carbon footprint to get there, but maybe what people see there will change daily habits, which in the long run might be the more powerful change.
Yeah, that's a good point. It is a good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because the people I bring, you know, we talk about more general wildlife environmental issues, of course, when we're there. So yeah, they go back hopefully actually pondering these issues a bit more about how they behave at home as well.
That's right. Yeah.
For example, in my own modest garden here in Hexham, I've created a little hay meadow, pond and hay meadow. And, you know, I talk to people about that and they're often quite interested and think, oh, maybe I could do that, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's also a kind of benefit of these trips.
Yeah.
To measure against the disbenefit of physically getting there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very hard to see people not traveling, Annie. I have to say that. The appetite for travel it's very strong. I think human beings, I mean, that is part of our DNA, isn't it? To be outward looking, to expand, to acquire resources. You know, the evolution has made us like that. That's why we're so successful as a species.
Yeah.
It's very, very hard to advocate people should not do things. I think that's a very difficult message and people don't want to hear it. So we've got to pitch it in a different way to do things, but maybe do different things or do them in different ways. Just telling people not to do things, not to go places, it's just not going to happen.
No, and put the emphasis on everyday life potentially rather than big trips, etc., or to do that in the most sustainable way. But actually, it's the everyday behaviors, you know, the 345 days out of the 365 days a year that might make a difference in the long run. Yes,
so people might be prepared to moderate. You know, they will be prepared to cycle short distances rather than drive, perhaps. But if you tell them not to go on holiday to Tenerife or wherever they want to go, they don't want to hear that.
No, there'll be a riot.
Well, yeah, they just wouldn't do it, would they?
No.
So, yeah, and we all do that, I guess. You know, I'm very conscious I have a large carbon footprint, so I try to, you know, compensate for that in other ways.
Yeah, I know.
You know, like the hay meadow thing, and you know, just driving less maybe when I'm here. I guess we all do that.
Yeah, but I suppose as well, you know, a lifetime's work in the area of environmental and kind of work and conservation maybe kind of offsets that a bit too.
Well, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I've never thought of it like that, but I suppose that's true, rather than being in investment banking or.
Yeah, well, exactly. It's not like
mining.
You've not run a coal-fired power station for the last 40 years, so.
Yeah. Well, maybe that buys me some credits.
Yes.
It doesn't quite feel like that. I mean, very conscious of the next generation, what they're going to inherit. Because I have children and grandchildren, and there's no doubt that, you know, all of these interesting initiatives going on, but if you look at the big picture, it's still going down.
Yeah.
We're still losing biodiversity. We're still losing abundance.
Yeah.
So all of the things we do so far are maybe slowing it a little bit, but
not changing the direction yet.
Not changing the direction of travel yet. So I have to be a bit pessimistic, I'm afraid.
That's allowed.
I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think there's some interesting perspectives developing, and I'm a historian, you know, I'm a modern historian, but there's historians out there working on deep time perspectives. So taking traditional historical approaches, but applying it right back to the Big Bang, basically, and you know, very long chronologies, that tens and hundreds and millions of years, kind of these changes and shifts. So, I mean, it's quite interesting because it makes you feel, I love that feeling of massive insignificance as well, which is that kind of, the deep time perspective does give you that. But I guess the danger of that is that it stops people doing, you know, people just think, oh, what's the point of trying to do anything, you know? That's not good. But you know, I mean, there's small things, you know, community ownership, and I've seen across Scotland and other places which are, you know, moving to net zero. Newcastle University is moving to net zero by 2030, and you know, so things are changing a bit, and maybe it's not fast enough, but at least there is a kind of an awareness now, and some action that's coming alongside that.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I agree, and I've, you know, seen a lot of change in my working life in this area. But I am driven back to looking at the big picture again and seeing it's still going down.
Yeah.
So whether we can actually plateau that out and maybe move it up, that's the huge challenge, isn't it? So maybe, you know, work to moderate climate change, of course, is in concert with, you know, it's often all about, you know, letting natural habitats soak up carbon again.
Yeah.
There's a new incentive to do the right thing through climate change, because it will create, you know, things like salt marshes and woodlands, of course, soak up a lot of carbon. We've got to keep our, you know, we've got to stop taking coal out of the ground, of course.
Yeah, I know.
Or peat, leave it alone. And so, that's an additional reason to do these things. Whether that'll be in a big enough scale is yet to be seen.
Yes, it probably is too. I mean, I guess what we can point to some green shoots, but as you say, it's not really affecting that big picture yet. But I suppose we have to keep making those efforts and hopefully see the changes come in the bigger picture. But I know. Well, I've held you for this fascinating conversation. I could go on and on. I think we must have to do a part 2, Keith.
Okay, that would be fine.
You're like,
we haven't quite covered all your questions, but I don't know if there's any last things you did want to kind of maybe sort of knock off.
I suppose the last one would be, you know, you talked at the start about how you wish you'd had a mentor when you were starting out. Is that the tip you'd give young people who are interested in natural history and want to get involved? I mean, what kind of advice would you give a young person?
Yeah, well, that's right. I felt, you know, looking back now, I had no idea. I was just interested, but I had no idea how to pursue that. I had no field guides. Well, I had the Observer's Book of Birds, which I bought from my friend. But of course, there were fewer field guides then. So, and some of them were rather impenetrable, the botanical ones particularly. So if I had someone who could have taken me out bird watching, say, or pond dipping, it just would have, I would have kind of made more progress more quickly and been able to decide what I was particularly interested in, rather than floundering around really and just exploring. I mean, there was a bit merit in that as well, of course. Just exploring all these local areas near where I lived. But I think, if I'd had, I think my advice to someone is, you know, try and find someone who's experienced at looking at various groups and go out with them and find out how they look at things, what the features are to look for, what resources there are to help you identify them, how you can get involved. You know, that to me would have made the biggest difference, I think. So that's what if a young person is interested,
Mhm.
that's what I would suggest they do. Find someone who's knowledgeable
Mhm.
and tag along with them.
I quite like your freestyle version of that film.
Yeah, there was some merit in that as well.
Yeah, yeah,
Falling out of trees and all of that.
yeah. Just sort of feeling your way almost. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, thank you so much, Keith, for your time and absolutely fascinating discussion. It's been absolutely brilliant, and I know the Natural History Society and members will love watching it as well. And I might just sneakily try and set up a part 2.
Okay, well, I'll leave that up to you, Annie. It's been a pleasure chatting to you anyway. So I hope it's been of some use and some interest. So
It definitely has, Keith. It was such a pleasure.